The camera that I'm using right now is the Sony a7R Mark V. The 61 megapixel powerhouse with 8K video, 4K video up to 60 frames a second. Wait, just 60 frames a second? And that seems to be a contributing factor for people not wanting to buy the Sony a7R Mark V. A lot of you are saying that you want the camera to have 100 or 120 frames a second in 4K, but to get that option, you have to go to the Sony A1. Now the camera does have 100 and 120 frames a second, but only when filming in 1080p. But with the image coming from an 8K sensor, it does make you think, how good is the 1080p footage? So let's find out. So what's your thoughts? It's funny, at first I also had my doubts about the 1080p footage. For a long time I've had the luxury of 4K, 100 FPS, 10-bit, 422, etc, etc. The camera that I was using before the R5 was the Sony a7S III, and let's be honest, it has very little limitations when it comes to image quality. So when I first ordered the a7R Mark V, I won't deny, I did worry a little bit about the lack of 100 frames a second in 4K because I like to have it for the creativity aspect of it. I've mentioned this in a few of my videos and you guys certainly have down in the comments. Now, even though 4K, yes, is pretty standard these days, there are still some benefits of using 1080p footage. But when using this camera, there is also some downsides. First off, as mentioned, the Sony a7R Mark V has a sensor capable of an 8K image. So for that sensor to get down to a 1080p image, then it has to do something with the rest of the information. Now, I'm not 100% sure about this, so if I'm wrong, please forgive me, but from what I've read on the internet, it uses pixel binning to create that image. Pixel binning is where you take a group of pixels, let's say 4 pixels together, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the camera sensor groups them together to create one big pixel. And there are pros and cons to pixel binning, but if I'm honest, I don't understand it enough to be able to give that information and educate anybody about it. However, pixel binning has been known to give you a better low light performance because them pixels together create a larger pixel and therefore a larger surface area, therefore it can collect more light. However, when I've done a few tests with the Sony a7R Mark V, when comparing it between 4K for instance and the 1080p footage, the difference in noise isn't that great. At first glance, the 1080p footage actually looks worse than the 4K footage in terms of noise, but that's because we're viewing a 1080p footage which has been upscaled onto a 4K timeline. Therefore, each pixel that you see from the 1080p footage is 4 times larger than what it would be on the 4K image. Therefore, any noise that is created from the camera sensor is more noticeable. Side note, I actually see that quite often when it comes to photography. When I'm doing photography with both the a7R Mark V and the Sony a7S Mark III, I always find that the a7R Mark V, I wouldn't say performs better in low light when it comes to photography than the S3, but I always feel like the R5 has less noticeable noise. But if you was to zoom into 100% and compare the two images side by side, they're pretty much identical. A couple other benefits that are pretty much a given, but I feel like I should mention them, is that your computer will probably perform better when it comes to editing when you're using a 1080p footage on a 1080p timeline. Fair enough, it isn't like all of us struggle with 4K footage, but I know for sure before I bought my new MacBook, I really struggled with 4K footage, always had to make proxies, and it just always lagged. Unfortunately, I am lucky enough to be able to go out and buy a top spec MacBook to be able to edit with, but I have to respect that not all of us are that lucky. And secondly, storage space, obviously. With 1080p in XAVC-S at 100 frames a second, you can get almost 5 hours of recording time from a single 128GB card, but that's 5 hours of playback time once everything's been recorded and slowed down, not 5 hours of genuine recording time. Whereas the 4K alternative in just 50 frames a second just gives me just under 2 hours. But let's be honest, most of us will overlook them benefits and even the compromises just to get that 4K quality. But what if I told you that if you've watched any of my recent YouTube videos, you've probably seen some 1080p footage thrown in there. And nobody has ever called me out on it, let's say. Nobody's ever turned around to me and said, Danny, that footage just doesn't look crispy. And let's be honest, it's probably not crossed anyone's mind. If I had to describe the look of 1080p footage from the Sony a7R Mark V, it's almost like taking a Pro Mist filter to soften the image without having the lovely bloomy highlights. Or maybe just going into your picture profile and turning down your sharpness ever so slightly. Because that's the big thing. At no point in this video am I ever going to turn around and say 1080p footage from the R5 looks as good as 4K, because that would be a really dumb thing to say. However, I wouldn't say that the 1080p footage looks bad. It's perfectly usable. And ultimately it comes down to what you're going to be filming and where you're going to be putting it. Are you making a film or a mini documentary? If so, then you probably don't want to film in 1080p, you probably want to film in 4K. But also at the same time, if you're doing that level of work, why are you using this camera? On the other hand, are you more like me? Are you just making content to be able to post on social media or here on YouTube? Let's be honest, anytime you upload anything to the internet, the compression just crushes the hell out of your footage. And I have no idea how this is actually gonna look on YouTube, but the big question is, are you actually viewing it in 4K or are you viewing it in something like 720 or 1080 because you're on your mobile phone? For me personally, I'm very happy using 1080p footage when it comes to my own personal projects. The requirement of having to record 100 or 120 frames a second probably outweighs the quality that I'm needing to record it in. However, when it comes to commercial projects such as weddings, then I would still use something like my Sony a7S Mark III, and the R5 isn't something that I would reach for straight away to start doing wedding videos. But also at the same time, if I really needed to film something in slow motion and I only had my A7R Mark V, then I would have to use it, and I highly doubt that anyone would actually notice just a few clips thrown in there. So I hope this answers any of the questions that you have about the quality of the 1080p on the Sony a7R Mark V. This has been quite a relaxed video, but if you've enjoyed the video and you want to see more content like this, then hit the subscribe button. And if you do, I'll see you right there. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you soon.